the rear or the track, we could immobilize a tank. At the same time, the German could hit ours in the front, and it destroyed our tank. So the American ingenuity immediately finds some strap metal, welds a little rack on the front of the tank, and piles on a layer of sandbags on front of the tank. Now the German 88 hits the sand, that mushrooms the shell then hits the armor, knocks it dead, and it makes a horrible noise if you're in the tank, but doesn't come inside with you. And therefore our tanks had a fighting chance to equal the German tanks that had been superior all through the war. Ours were more maneuverable, and we took advantage of that. Therefore, we would work it so we could get at them from the side or from the rear or shoot the track off, but we couldn't stop them by hitting it in the front of the tank. Today, if we hit that with a 120 millimeter rifle on our tanks today, it not only blows the turret clear off of their tank and blows it 65 feet away, which it did in the Desert Storms campaign of the same German tanks that were fantastic in our problem. Well, all right. When Patton sees these tanks come into his command with a rack welded full of sandbags that would protect that tank from being destroyed with the first shot that hit it, he had a conniption fit. I can't use the language that he used every day. You yellow SOBs, get those sandbags off that tank. We explained why they were on there, how many lives it saves, how many tanks it saves. Oh, you chicken, a few more adjectives. And the sandbags went off of the tanks. All right. The German are now going to pull their southern pincer movement and surround the armies and win the war. They stick the 14th Armored Division in front of that and says, today you stop them. Doesn't matter the cost, stop them. Of the same German tanks that were fantastic in our problem. Well, all right. When Patton sees these tanks come into his command with a rack welded full of sandbags that would protect that tank from being destroyed with the first shot that hit it, he had a conniption fit. I can't use the language that he used every day. You yellow SOBs, get those sandbags off that tank. We explained why they were on there, how many lives it saves, how many tanks it saves. Oh, you chicken, a few more adjectives. And the sandbags went off of the tanks. All right. The German are now going to pull their southern pincer movement and surround the armies and win the war. They stick the 14th Armored Division in front of that and says, today you stop them. Doesn't matter the cost, stop them. When we started that morning, we had 58 tanks in one combat command, 57 tanks in the other one. 2 combat tanks on the line, 1 in reserve. That if the Germans got past these, then they still had 1 to contend with. When we got through shooting that night, we had 14 tanks in one combat command and 13 tanks in the other, which meant 4 men for each tank had also probably been killed, and that many that had been done. Along with it, the infantry that was with the German tanks got not 1 inch further than their tanks did. And we realized that at the end of that day, the Germans did not have one single thing that could stop us. We could now go right through them. They had used everything they had to hit us, and our reserve of 58 tanks could walk right through them. And therefore, our division commander said, "Can we go on the offensive?" Patton says, "No, you can't. Hold what ground you've got. Your orders are to hold your ground. Stop the Germans. They're stopped. Can we now go on the offensive? We can go right through them." "No, you can't. Stay there." We didn't realize the damage, of course, that had happened to the rest of the line. We were looking only at our situation right here. We knew we had the Germans whipped right there. We could have gone 50 miles through them if they'd let us do so. But there was nothing left to support an offensive. We didn't know that. And undoubtedly, Patton knew that an offensive without the support to supply it and keep it going and the trucks rolling behind it would only produce a disaster. And so at that point, though, our end of the Battle of the Bulge never went beyond that point. The Germans did not penetrate another foot. It was over at that point. And so their northern offensive got bogged down about as bad around Bastogne, and at that point, the Germans had lost the war.
When you were in that situation and all the violence and shooting and everything going on around you, how did you feel shooting at other people?
You recognized an 18-year-old boy doesn't have great amounts of feelings, but he does understand very thoroughly. I'm going over there to win a war, and they're going to be shooting at me, and I have got to shoot at them and kill them before they kill me. It's either kill or be killed. That's the choice. And I'm a good enough shot that they better get me the first time or I will get them. And therefore, it didn't bother me too much because I realized that, hey, I can hold my own with that German over there, and he better be a darn good shot, and he better make that first shot count or I'm going to get him, and I intend to do it. And therefore, it didn't bother me to shoot at him too much. There was one very interesting little thing that did happen. In that town of Hatton, when I was upstairs shooting at any German that moved, I saw a German come out of a house 125 yards at most to walk around the corner of the house. And Brother Rencher says, "You are a dead German." And he shot at that German, and he sees the dust fly off the bricks beside the German, 2 inches from his neck probably. It's a puff of dust just right next to his neck. And Brother Rencher was so totally amazed that he missed that he didn't even shoot the second shot that would have killed him. And afterward, a thought came into his mind. There was an LDS mother somewhere in Germany that prayed that her son would be protected that day. And the Lord just protected him. And I don't know that the mind was true, but Brother Rencher could not believe he missed that German. It was impossible for him to have missed that German. But he only had to wiggle 1,000th of an inch for 1/10 of a second to put the bullet 2 inches away from the neck that would have killed him, to answer the mother's prayer. It probably was answered. I don't have any idea. He was an LDS soldier. I don't have any idea. There was an LDS mother praying for him, but I did know he should have been dead. And I knew he should have been dead. And I knew I would kill him. And I didn't. So you never know what happens in a war. That's the kind of situation you're in. And you take it. It doesn't bother you. Go on the next day. It'll happen the day after that. And you just keep going ahead until you've won the war.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Can I jump ahead now to when you freed the camp at Mooseburg?
All right. Right after, let me see if I can put it in perspective. As soon as we stopped the Germans at Hatton, then within a week or two, staying right there, defending the line, but no German offensive coming. We weren't fighting anybody. Artillery would come in on us. The Germans would use a lot of artillery to try to disrupt us and keep us from advancing any, but we were not seeing any attempt to run over the top of us or kill us. All right, so then they moved us back into the 7th Army and gave us the assignment to head for Munich, Germany. So our 7th Army is now on the south flank, and the north flank is having, they're fighting tooth and toenail. And we aren't for a while having much trouble, and then they put a division of, a special SS division that were composed mainly of young kids. I would say 80% of them were under 18. A lot of them were 13 and 14. And they were completely fanatical. They didn't understand the word surrender in the very slightest. You could have them completely surrounded, outgunned, totally cut off, and the only way they would ever give up is you killed them. They would never quit shooting at you. They would never put their hands in the air. They would never give up. They would come out shooting, and you had to kill them. And so we were fighting tooth and toenail as hard as we had done anywhere in the 7th Offensive. And this remained for a while. And then the order came through that there is a prison camp at the town of Mooseburg, Germany, and the intelligence says there is probably 105,000 Allied prisoners in that camp. It's the 14th Armored's job to get to that camp before the Germans can move them. They said the Germans will be bringing in everything they can, and the Air Force with their P-47s, fighter bombers, have demolished the railroads and the trains sufficiently that they probably can't get at them with trains, but they will get trucks in there and they'll try to get them out. It's your job to get to that prison camp before they can bring their trucks in and get them out. And we had been fighting this bunch that were fanatical, and it was anything but sounded like a picnic. It sounded like we have no chance of getting 90 miles to get to that prison camp the way things have been going. Because we would do lucky to make a mile or two in many days. And so we said, all right. And the combat command says, we will open the gate. And then a company of tanks, 2 platoons of infantry to support them, and 1 platoon of engineers get that down that 90 miles, and we, the combat command, will come behind and try to keep the road open. Your job is to go through. We will get you through, but once we have broken the line and gone beyond the front line of the Germans, then you're on your own. And so the orders were, have 10 days supply tied on that tank of everything you need: gasoline, K rations, C rations, ammunition, demolition equipment, everything you need for 10 days of the toughest fighting you've done in the war so far. Because you may be cut off, surrounded, no supplies will get through until the combat command can reopen the thing, and that may be 10 days of mighty hard fighting from both directions. And so they said, all right, you're to leave as soon as you can see anything in the morning, and you've got to get to that prison camp before the day is over. Go. And so we climbed in. The engineers were in a half-track with a 50 caliber machine gun mounted in the front of it with a circular mount so they could point in any direction, like shoot at aircraft coming from any direction. 2 30 caliber machine guns mounted on each side with 10 men in it, 5 on each side with rifles to do their shooting, 5/8-inch thick armor all the way around it, and in front with the driver looking through a little slot to go right down that road behind those tanks, shooting anything that moved. All right, we left when it was so early you couldn't see the road in front of you, and we could hear our company of tanks punching the hole through on the road, having a heck of a firefight up ahead of us. And so we could anticipate that, hey, we've got 90 miles of the worst fighting in the world, and we'll be lucky if we get 5. We may get 5 miles, we may get 10. By then we'll be so shot up, we'll be lucky to come back. And so we caught up with the tanks that had gone down to open the hole, and they said, as far as we know, you won't see any Germans for a while. We've eliminated all that are around here. Go. And so we took off, and once in a while a tank up ahead of us would do some serious shooting, but we never found a German army. We went those 90 miles from, by the time we really got started was probably about 5 o'clock. And I got the idea that we had rolled in the early afternoon. When I read the account of the people that were there and knew precisely what time it was just barely at noon. The tanks got to the prison camp at 1 o'clock. They got to the town of Moosburg at 12. And we run into some German interference. We'd hit a German recon and knock out a couple of their recon vehicles. Or occasionally we would run into an anti-tank unit that was stationed on the road to try to stop us. They had undoubtedly notified their people to bring anything that they could to try to stop the thing, but they had nothing. They didn't really have an army to fight us. And therefore we ended up getting there at noon. They run an American flag up in the town of Moosburg, one of the tankers did, and then the tankers positioned themselves around the town, the roads coming in, because they were sure the Germans would mount an offensive. And so they were looking for how can we protect the prison camp long enough to get the men out, because they were sure the Germans would hit us with everything they had. And our half-tracks with the machine guns were coming along behind, and so it's your job to go up to the prison camp and get the thing open. One tank and our lieutenant in a Jeep and a couple of half-tracks of 50 yards behind, or 100 maybe, rolled up to the prison camp. And here are all the guards around it with machine guns and with weapons, but they're not shooting at us, which is really amazing, except you'd hear a few shots periodically, but we didn't see any bullets come our way or didn't realize anyone was shooting specifically at our half-track at least. And so the lieutenant signaled for us to get out, and so we were busy disarming these Germans. There was a officer that came up, and he's wearing a dress sword and his pistol. Boy, he was all for the occasion. And I said, give me your weapons. And he handed over his Luger, and one that was with him handed over a .32 Beretta pistol. And I said, your sword is still a weapon. And he took his sword off and gave me his sword. But by then, fighting in the world, and we'll be lucky if we get 5. We may get 5 miles, we may get punching the holes through on the road, having a heck of a firefight up ahead of us. And so we could anticipate that, hey, we've got 90 miles of the worst fighting in the world, and we'll be lucky if we get 5. We may get 5 miles, we may get 10, by then we'll be so shot up, we'll be lucky to come back. And so we caught up with the tanks that had gone down to open the hole. And they said, as far as we know, you won't see any Germans for a while. We've eliminated all that are around here. Go. And so we took off, and once in a while a tank up ahead of us would do some serious shooting, but we never found a German army. We went those 90 miles from, by the time we really got started was probably about 5 o'clock. And I got the idea that we had rolled in the early afternoon. When I read the account of the people that were there and knew precisely what time it was just barely at noon. The tanks got to the prison camp at 1 o'clock. They got to the town of Moosburg at 12. And we run into some German interference. We'd hit a German recon and knock out a couple of their recon vehicles. Or occasionally we would run into an anti-tank unit that was stationed on the road to try to stop us. They had undoubtedly notified their people to bring anything that they could to try to stop the thing, but they had nothing. They didn't really have an army to fight us. And therefore, we ended up getting there at noon. They run an American flag up in the town of Moosburg, one of the tankers did, and then the tankers positioned themselves around the town, the roads coming in, because they were sure the Germans would mount an offensive. And so they were looking for how can we protect the prison camp long enough to get the men out, because they were sure the Germans would hit us with everything they had. And our half-tracks with the machine guns were coming along behind, and so it's your job to go up to the prison camp and get the thing open. One tank and our lieutenant in a Jeep and a couple of half-tracks of 50 yards behind, or 100 maybe, rolled up to the prison camp. And here are all the guards around it with machine guns and with weapons, but they're not shooting at us, which is really amazing, except you'd hear a few shots periodically, but we didn't see any bullets come our way or didn't realize anyone was shooting specifically at our half-track at least. And so the lieutenant signaled for us to get out, and so we were busy disarming these Germans. There was a officer that came up, and he's wearing a dress sword and his pistol. Boy, he was all for the occasion. And I said, "Give me your weapons." And he handed over his Luger, and one that was with him handed over a .32 Beretta pistol. And I says, "Your sword is still a weapon." And he took his sword off and gave things too much. And so I never took the opportunity to see the show because it was fairly graphic. But when he says, "Why so graphic?" he says, "Only because I couldn't show it like it really was." And he didn't. That's right. He did not show it like it really was. It was worse than he showed.
Which, for any of us who saw it, is amazing, you know.
Fortunately, I was 18 years old, 19, and 20 by the time it ended. I was there for 3 years.
During occupation,
And
enrollment.
at that age, life is pretty happy-go-lucky on the road, and a sniper will shoot at us out of it.
You know what, actually, Heather, can you just do a quick touch here on the eyes? Just got a little bit shiny. I'm sorry, Grant.
Berg, Germany.
Okay, hang on just a second. Tell me when you're ready, Grant. Okay.
We're in Moosburg, Germany, protecting ourselves from a German attack that we knew would be full blast any second, any minute. We expected hordes of German tanks to come rolling in, and they just didn't happen to send. Well, all right. We were disarming the guards, but now 130 prisoners that have been in there.
I had to pick that up. You said 130 prisoners.
1,000.
Okay, go ahead and start that again, if you would, just from disarming the guards.
We were involved in getting all the resistance that might occur controlled so it wouldn't occur. Taking the guns from everybody that had one and looking for anybody else that might have one. Being on the alert for civilians or anybody that could be shooting at us in a second's notice. And so we were so busy of doing our thing to control the military situation that what was happening in the camp was off on the side, kind of, from our interest at the moment. And by the time we got over close to the gate, by then the gate was being pushed open, and it was like unplugging the Teton Dam. 130,000 flood came out of that camp. And I remember as I watched them swarm around our half-track and the tanks and everything that was in the area, that I have just solved the biggest problem in America. The biggest health problem in America is that everybody in America is 20 to 100 pounds overweight. And out of 130,000 prisoners, I did not see one overweight person come through the gate. All I got to do to solve all the obesity in the United States is put them in a Moosburg prison camp for 6 months, and I've solved all the obesity problems. Most of them were walking skeletons. Our 10-day supply of food on all the tanks, strapped on every way they could tie them onto that tank, along with the gasoline cans, were cases and cases of K rations. We had to have food for 10 days. There will be no way food can come into us for at least 10 days. You better be prepared to fight 10 days with what food you carry on the back. Within 5 minutes, we hadn't eaten since 4 o'clock that morning. We hadn't stopped to snack. We'd maybe break open a K-ration and eat as we were going, but you were so intent on what's out here that might be a hazard to you that you're not really thinking about eating. You don't even think that you are getting hungry. Occasionally someone would maybe open a K-ration and munch on it, but we didn't really consider eating much. And after that gate had been open 5 minutes, and things had a little bit slowed down, someone said, "Hey, it's dinner time." And we did not have one single candy bar, K-ration, can of beans, C-ration, or anything that we could eat or drink. Every single morsel we had, and every single morsel every tank and every other half-track and every truck and every Jeep had been given. And then that tide from the Teton Dam went throughout the entire town of Moosburg, and you'd hear pistol shots and rifle shots occasionally. It wasn't Germans shooting at us. The prisoners had gathered up a few guns they had, and they were killing pigs and cows and chickens. Any animal that was edible, they killed on the spot. They took it to pieces on the spot, they cooked it on the spot, and they ate it. And therefore, by the next day, there was not one edible animal left in the town. They had eaten everything that was edible. The Germans would store great crocks of eggs when the hens were laying, and then they'd eat them for the next 6 months. They'd store them in salt water where they wouldn't decompose. No bacteria could get to them, and they would keep for months. There was not one single egg left in a house. In all of Moosburg, Germany, the prisoners had eaten everything that was edible, their gardens, their vegetables, their cows, their pigs, their chickens. Fortunately, I didn't stay any longer than that. Now the flood was turned over to division headquarters. The combat command coming up the road behind us had a corridor completely protected from Germans stopping them, and therefore they could come in and haul the prisoners out and get them home without another man being lost from the thing. And amazingly, the war for us only lasted about 1 week after that. And then the Germans were so well demolished from their offensive and from the Americans just running over the top of them that the war was essentially over. That was about the last significant thing we did in the war.
When you first came in, when we first started talking about the fact, I was intrigued with the fact that you were there from D-Day to
the last bullet that was shot.
Maybe you might just talking about that, the span of the battles that you fought, just to kind of encapsulate it.
In fact, when I read what had been taped that I'd said, I said, this is so poor, it should never go into a book. It doesn't tell the story at all. It's telling of what we did this day, and maybe what we did this day. But here are 600 days in between that is really the story. Every day when you get up, if you're on the line, you know you may not be alive that night. You're going to be in a situation where you may have to kill or you may have to be killed. Many, many days it wasn't that tense. There wouldn't be a big offensive coming your way and you could take things fairly normal. But days even when it's fairly normal, we'd run into snipers or to artillery shell that would come in that would do a surprising amount of damage, and therefore people were killed all the time in the process. And so is that poor old GI that fights his way through the whole thing that Colin Powell says, here's the man of the century. He handed back to the world liberty that was in the process of being lost, and he gave it back. He's the man of the century. He was. He was the man of the century. Many of those infantry divisions we were fighting with had a component of 15,000 men. From the time they started the skirmish until it ended, they had replaced that division in men that were killed and replaced 6 times. 90,000 men had gone through that infantry division while it was in France and Germany. And that was happening every day. And therefore the story wasn't just what happened on Normandy or just what happened at the Battle of the Bulge. It was the process of saving liberty every day from the time it started until it finally ended in May of 1940. What? 4 in Europe, 45 in Japan.
Any, when you look back on it?
I don't want to relive it.
No? Yeah.
I'm not really sorry that I was there. It had to be done. And I deserved to be the person that was involved in doing it as much as anybody else. And I didn't once begrudge that they put me there. It had to be done, and I had to do my share of it. And if they said, come on, you got to go do it again, I would say, okay, I'm ready. Give me that M1 rifle and we're off again. But it was something that you only live once, and you do try to forget it just as much as you can. You don't want to relive it. And therefore, when I was driving to come up here, I didn't really think that I would be telling you the story. I thought I would talk you out of it, that it wasn't one that really needed to be told. It was just one poor little old country boy's experience of living life that has been fantastically good to him. He got back from the war. They gave him the chance for a GI Bill to go to school that he never would have had he not been in that war. And in that school, the GI Bill gave him a chance to go to, he met a little blonde girl from Salt Lake because he had an aunt that boarded there. They enjoyed each other's company, were married in the Salt Lake Temple by President McKay, that was then a counselor to the president. And that counselor said to us before he married us, he says, Brother Rencher, marriage is not a 50-50 proposition. If you will spend 60% of your time, your money, your concern, your effort, your interest, your thoughts for this young woman, you will always love her because you love whom you serve. That's the Lord's law of love. Then he turned to that little blonde and said, Sister Burbage, if you will spend 60% of your time, your money, your thoughts, your efforts, your concerns for this young man, you will always love him. Because the Lord's law of love is you love whom you serve. And he says, I promise you, in the name of the Lord, 50 years from now, you will love her more than you do today. Try it. He then married us. I was taught more in 20 minutes in the Salt Lake Temple on making a success of marriage than all the marriage counselors in the world has taught in the 78 years that I've lived. I've listened to hundreds of them at Know Your Religions, at Education Weeks, at BYU, and all over. And none of them have ever repeated what I learned in 20 minutes in the Salt Lake Temple to make a successful marriage. Today, 54 years, just a few days ago from that time, she's my sweetie pie, and I love her more, 1,000 times more, than I did that day in the Salt Lake Temple. And I suggest it to you, and to you, and to you, and to you, and to you, because it absolutely works. It's absolutely true. He was absolutely a prophet of God that gave me the most wonderful life anybody has ever had. That is Brother Rencher's story.
That's a cut. Thank you.
We missed one thing, Jay.
Oh, I missed a whole lot.
The last.
Okay, tell me about the last day.
All right. After we had done our job at Moosburg, they called us back and says, capture Munich, Germany. Go for it. And we found we caught up with those SS kids that we'd been fighting with, and they did a commendable job of slowing us down and fighting again. And we were having anything but a picnic. We were hearing about whole areas of the German army that were surrendering by the army, by the division, all surrendering at once. Not those cockeyed 14-year-old kids. They were fighting like dogs. And so we were having a tough time. And we pulled up to a very sizable river, and my friend back there can tell you the name of it. I had forgotten it until he looked at a map and reminded me where it was. It was a big river, about not quite as big as a snake, but darn near. It was a sizable river. We pulled up to that, and they retreated across the river and blew the bridge so we couldn't advance. That meant to get on to Munich, we had to then go build a pontoon bridge across this. That is a major undertaking, but can be done in a day's time or a day and a half time. So we arranged for vehicles to bring up the pontoons and the connecting girders, treadway that you hook from one pontoon to the other that builds the bridge, and the compressor to inflate the pontoons and everything we need to build a bridge across that river. We also see that on the other side of that river, all the high country is controlled by the Germans with 88 millimeter rifles that can still shoot you right between the nose. And therefore, we didn't relish the thoughts of building that pontoon bridge down there with all the German army that we had been fighting for the last 10 days that had been anything but a picnic. It had been tough. To make matters more interesting, the next day was my birthday. And I said, all right, Brother Rencher, you've made it through this crazy war this far, but tomorrow you're going to check out. There isn't any way. There will be 10 engineers left alive down there trying to get that bridge built tomorrow. They just cannot do it. There's no way we can build that bridge with them controlling all the high country with perfect opportunity to blow us out of the water. I said, that's the way the war is. You win a few and you lose a few. Let's go. So 4 o'clock the next morning, we were to load up on our trucks with all the gear that we needed, with tanks on this side to help support us, to do all the best shooting they could. And I knew that wasn't nearly enough, because they didn't know where those gun emplacements were over there at all, except a few that they would see fire, they could fire back. That's usually a little too late. And so at 4 o'clock in the morning, we come out of that bedroll and roll it up, pile it in the corner and say, we'll probably never unroll it again. Let's go. We got in our truck, and here comes a little motorcycle, put, down the road. And you have on the Army a little teeny, you tape everything of the light except one little slit that gives you just a beam right down the middle of the road, so that the enemy can't see from far away the big lights that tell them things are going on. And here's this motorcycle with this little blackout light putting down the road. And what the devil is that? Well, he pulls up to the Jeep where our company commander is and says, you better read this before we go any further, and hands him a communique from Army headquarters, not division headquarters. And the communication is, we feel the war is over, make no offensive move unless fired upon. Hold what ground you have, but don't attempt to go any further. We feel the war is over. It's collapsing on all fronts, except ours, I might add. And therefore, don't do anything that will draw you under fire. And when the captain stood up and read that to the whole convoy and said, go back to bed, we had a whole bunch of signal flares and concussion grenades and tracer bullets, and all of a sudden the commotion that started shooting in the air, flares and tracers and concussion grenades going off all around the thing. I'm sure the Germans over there expecting all heck to break loose on them tomorrow. Wonder what in the devil are those drunk Americans doing on the other side of that river? They're celebrating some crazy thing, and they didn't know they were celebrating my birthday. And so Brother Rencher didn't check out on the 3rd of May. Instead, he went back to bed and slept very soundly for another 2 hours. And the war was indeed over. We never shot another shot after the one in the air celebrating. And we didn't ever build the bridge until 2 weeks later. We built the bridge across the river so the traffic could go to Munich without interference.
All right, let's go. I'm so glad you told that.